Welcome to FADA's virtual 2021 annual convention and exhibition. This session is the FADA Legislative Update. Before we begin, we'd like to take a moment to review the logistics of today's webinar. All attendees' cameras and microphones will be muted throughout the event. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. At any time during the session, please use the Q&A link in the toolbar to submit your questions. Please do not submit via chat, as we will not be monitoring this for audience questions. We are recording the session and we'll make it available on the Whova app and web and mobile app following this session. And as a reminder, the discussions in this session are not for media use. For quotes and more information, please contact FADA directly. And now I'd like to introduce Tim Kaiser, Executive Director of FADA, who will make the opening remarks.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today, or I should say good morning to those of you on the West Coast. We very much appreciate you participating in our annual convention. We're very pleased to do this meeting for free as a member service, and it's your support that enables us to do that, the support of all you members, affiliates, exhibitors, and sponsors. So thank you very much for that support. Let me talk about the first topic on the first slide, Blake, if we could go to the first slide, please. And that's the recent appeals court victory. And the FADA staff, you saw their names on the slide previously. Each of them will get into other topical areas that are very timely. But I wanted to begin this session with the recent appeals court victory, because this is a topic that is not only important just to the plaintiffs in the lawsuit, but to the entire industry. You may recall that almost a decade ago, FADA led a lawsuit against the Department of Housing and Urban Development because of HUD's scheme at the time to require PHAs to effectively use their operating reserves, their excess operating reserves, as HUD called them, for their everyday expenses. We recognized this as an illegal action immediately and brought suit in federal court against the department. As litigation takes quite a bit of time to go through that process, we ultimately prevailed in that first lawsuit. And the court ruled in our favor and awarded damages of $136 million to more than 300 plaintiffs. Now, because of the success of that case, we sued in a second round, adding 500 more plaintiffs a couple of years ago. That case took quite a while to go through the courts, and we did initially prevail through a summary judgment. Now, right around the same time as we prevailed in a summary judgment, we started hearing from HUD that the annual contributions contract is not in fact a contract, and that the department possesses the latitude to change the terms of that contract as it deems appropriate. We clearly thought this was illegal based on not only the court victory, but on the statute itself. Now, the reason I began by saying this is an important victory for all PHAs, not just the plaintiffs, and I should add that we did win the appeal 3-0 just very recently, about a month ago, we won that appeal. The Court of Appeals made it very clear in their ruling that, contrary to what HUD has said in recent years, the annual contributions contract is a legally binding contract on HUD and is not, in fact, something like a mere grant agreement. And I want to read you the language that the court used. It said, quote, that the ACC its essential purpose, quote, is to contractually obligate HUD to pay monetary subsidies to housing authorities in exchange for their operation of public housing projects in accordance with regulatory and statutory requirements, unquote. And then the court went on to add that, quote, the ACCs contractually obligate HUD to pay the PHAs their operating subsidy or their prorated operating subsidy amount if insufficient funds are available. Now, I want to make it clear, there's nothing in the ACC that says that HUD has to pay you 100%. We all know that. But if HUD does not have sufficient funds to pay your agencies 100%, they must use the negotiated rulemaking formula, which stipulates that they prorate the assistance evenly to every PHA. And that's been in regulation for many years, going back to when FADA trustee, former President Rick Parker, and I participated in the negotiated rulemaking more than a decade ago, in fact. So again, the reason this case is so important, not just to the plaintiffs, it's important to the entire industry, because the court very clearly is siding with the industry's position that the ACC is in fact a contract. We have gone to Congress to prevent HUD from making unilateral changes to the ACC. We'll continue to do so if necessary. But this language clearly strengthens the industry and FADA's position. And I must say that as executive director of FADA, I'm so proud of this organization for leading this important litigation against the federal government. We really have taken the lead, and that's just a testament to the FADA Board of Trustees and the leadership. I would add one final point, and that is that the government can still appeal this victory, or this decision, I should say, but they have 5 months, up to 5 months, to decide whether to appeal that to the US Supreme Court. Our attorneys do not believe they will, but of course, there's no way to know for sure. But as I said, in the meantime, we have a very strong case here, and I think this strengthens our hand should the department seek to, again, unilaterally change the ACC. We'll take questions later on, but with that, I want to turn to the next slide and turn it over to Arlene Kahn.
Thank you, Tim. Just get my notes. Hi, everyone. I'm here to talk to you about the FY22 fiscal year 22 federal budget, as well as the low-income housing tax credit. Early last month, President Biden issued what we're calling a budget outline for FY22, because to a large extent, it only contains top line numbers for department funding. The full budget is expected the last week of May. This is the first budget in a decade that is not subject to federal sequestration limits, which means that the president had the opportunity to significantly increase domestic discretionary spending, which includes HUD, and the president did so by 16%. Compare this to defense funding, which he only increased by 1.7%. At the HUD budget hearing, when in the last few weeks, the HUD secretary said, this shows you what the president values in his budget, that decision. Related to HUD, this translates to a proposed budget of $68.7 billion, which represents an increase from last year of $9 billion or 15%, really unprecedented. The emphasis on domestic programs over defense spending, however, makes this year's budget process more contentious than previous years. And we do expect that there will be very tight vote margins in both chambers of Congress as a result, and will make it very challenging for the president to see passage of this budget proposal before the current fiscal year ends on September 30th. What we do know from the president's proposed budget outline is that there is some significant funding for Section 8 and public housing. And I'll give you an outline of some of that. There's an expansion of the Housing Choice Voucher Program with a $5.4 billion increase in funding, representing 200,000 additional vouchers. And also there's funding to assist all currently assisted households. the priorities for these 200,000 vouchers are for those who are homeless or fleeing domestic violence, and also mobility-related supportive services to help families move to higher opportunity areas. At that same HUD hearing that I mentioned, Secretary Fudge said that she anticipates 100,000 of these vouchers to be used in FY22 for the categories I stated, but that the other 100,000 could be used by FY25, and she could see uses being expanded beyond those that I mentioned. Significantly, there is $3.2 billion for the capital fund, an increase of $435 million above the 2021 enacted level. And I will say more about the capital fund after this, because there's also some news about that in the infrastructure bill. But as Dominique Blum, the Deputy General Assistant Secretary, pointed out at our opening yesterday, it's been over a decade since we've seen a 3 in the capital fund. And we've made that point for as long as I've been at PHADA, that we haven't seen anything at 3 billion or over since over the last decade. So that's great to see. And there's also 800 million proposed for new investments, modernization and rehabilitation of HUD assisted housing, which are targeted to energy efficiency and resilience to the effects of climate change. There's an increase of 40 million for $400 million in total for lead hazard and healthy homes grants. And there's 3.5 billion, which is an increase of 500 million for homeless assistance grants. And that's to support an additional 100,000 households, including survivors of domestic violence and homeless youth. There's some increases in community development block grant program, 325 million there. For a total of 3.8 billion, and there's an increase of 550 million in home for a total of 1.9 billion. The other point to make about the FY22 budget is there's already so much funding either proposed or enacted related to COVID-19, all of which totals about $7.5 trillion. So that's going to make the budget process more challenging as well. That amount is 10 times the amount proposed by President Obama during the Great Recession, just to give you a sense of scale. So coming back to the capital fund that I mentioned earlier, in the American Jobs Plan, which is the infrastructure bill that President Biden proposed, this was just a week before the budget came out. And by the way, that the budget outline is 1.5 trillion. I don't think I mentioned that. So then the following week, he came out with about a $2.3 trillion infrastructure plan. And that is where $40 billion is targeted to the capital fund. PHADA, as you know from attending these conferences, has been advocating probably more than a decade, but certainly the last few years for a higher figure for the capital fund than anything that's ever been proposed. We followed the $26 billion that APT proposed in the HUD study that said that was the capital backlog. But that figure, after almost a decade, was revised by PHADA. We came up with a figure of at least 70 billion, was championed by our previous president, John Clark, in his president's column, and was picked up by the House Financial Services Committee from Maxine Waters' Housing as Infrastructure Act bill. And many other organizations and associations and legislators have now picked up that figure. So that's an important figure. We are still advocating for the total 70 billion, but I think everyone recognizes that $40 billion for the capital fund would be fantastic as well. Yesterday at that same session, the opening session with Dominique Blum, we asked a question, because she talked about the fact that this money could leverage other funding, like 4% and 9% tax credits, the capital fund financing program, the operating fund financing program, and RAD, to leverage about 80 to $100 billion from the 40 billion. And she sees it as a game changer, she said, and she sees it as probably the only money that we can expect to see, and that we should look at it that way. But the HUD secretary at her hearing said she views it as a down payment. And there are still many legislators who are pushing for the 70 billion. So we might get into this a little bit more in the question and answer session, but there are a number of a number of bills that are requesting significant funding right now, including Housing Trust Fund, the Green New Deal, and a home ownership program. And all of those have much higher figures than the $40 billion. So I don't think we think it's unreasonable to keep pushing for the 70 billion we've been advocating for over a decade. In addition to that 70 billion for the capital fund, there's $213 billion in that infrastructure plan for other housing to build, preserve, and retrofit more than 2 million homes and commercial buildings. And that includes examining state and local exclusionary zoning laws, which often are problematic in creating affordable housing. PHADA will keep you apprised of the budget as it's released and as the House and Senate take up their own negotiations after seeing the president's budget. And we'll also keep you apprised of the infrastructure bill with this historic capital funding provision. Just quickly, I will just add that in March, when the American Rescue Plan Act was released, which is $1.9 trillion in COVID funding, that included $50 billion in assistance for housing and homelessness, with $27.4 billion for rental assistance, and that's in addition to the $25 billion that was provided for the same purpose under FY21 appropriations, bringing the total to $45 billion for those emergency renter funds. Those are the funds that are being administered by the Treasury Department, and we've written quite a bit about those because we basically found out from the Treasury Department in our efforts that public housing residents and voucher holders could be eligible for those funds. And that's something the Treasury has clarified to those who've received those funds. And this is also where the $5 billion for emergency vouchers is included, and Seth will be talking about this shortly, so I'll leave those details to him. But HUD will be holding webinars and providing extensive technical assistance on that. So moving on to the low-income housing tax credit, also known as LIHTC. On April 15th, a bipartisan group of legislators reintroduced the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act of 2021. Again, led by Maria Cantwell, Democrat from Washington, who's been sponsoring this bill in the last 3 sessions of Congress. This is the 4th. And those provisions are expected to be considered probably with the $213 billion in housing resources under the infrastructure plan in terms of a vehicle for moving that legislation through. We're still collecting. So PHADA works with the Action Campaign. And the Action Campaign is a coalition of 2,400 national, state, and local organizations and businesses that work to address the shortage of affordable housing. And one of the ways they do that is by expanding and strengthening LIHTC. And we've been a member, and I actually work on the legislative panel, a group that meets twice a month and looks at all of the provisions that are in the bill. Several dozen provisions to improve LIHTC. And so they're basically, the bill itself has a number of key highlights that I would just point out to you. There's an increase in the 9% LIHTC authority by 25% for both 2021 and 2022, where previously this had been something that was supposed to happen over 5 years. It's now being pushed into 2 years. There's a new provision which some of our members were interested in to lower the bond financing threshold from 50 to 25%, which would make bond resources and the associated 4% credits available to more deals and reduce transactional costs, which are associated with project financing. That alone, Nova Gradac estimates that this provision could result in an additional 1.5 million units financed over 10 years. And there's also a state discretionary basis boost of up to 30% for bond finance properties, which provides the same discretion that states currently enjoy for the 9% credit. There's a lot of information on our website about low-income housing tax credits, a lot of articles we've written lately, and all of the fact sheets with summaries of the different provisions and how this bill compares to the previous bill. So I say if you're interested, go to our website to look at some of those. Also, if you're interested, to talk to your representatives and your senators in Congress and support this bill. And also consider joining the Action Campaign. It's a really great group of organizations, and you can be involved, and you can let people know what your issues are locally, and have some of those things addressed in future legislation if you feel very strongly about them. We have a number of members who work very closely with the campaign, so I encourage you to consider that. And that's my presentation, and I will turn it over to Seth.
Thanks, Arlene. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about the Emergency Housing Voucher Program, which Arlene just mentioned, the $5 billion program, $5 billion program that almost 700 PHAs already have gotten their award letters for. And I believe you have until Monday to reply to HUD in terms of if you'll take the vouchers, all of them, some of them, or none of them. It's completely voluntary and your discretion. I do want to pick up on something Arlene said, which is that HUD has already started technical assistance on that with a number of webinars, including one after this session. So there's one that begins after this session. You can go to hud.gov/EHV for more information on that and the upcoming schedule. For webinars, this one's about targeting to certain populations, I believe. So I want to start by talking about the issue with the COC. So many of you know that if you've been awarded these vouchers, you're required to have a partnership with your local COC, continuum of care, to accept referrals. That is something that we've heard some about in terms of some concerns there, either that, some PHAs have great relationships with their COCs, some not so great, and some are concerned about the capacity of the COC to provide enough referrals or timely referrals or complete referrals for the program. And so it's really important that you structure your MOU with the COC in a way that takes into consideration your relationship or lack of relationship with the COCs to ensure that you're not disadvantaged, because as we'll talk about later, the amount of funds you get administratively will depend in part by how quickly you lease the vouchers. And so you don't want a lag in the beginning on referrals to slow you down and prevent you from maximizing revenue and fees under this program. So, PHADA was happy to draft a legislative proposal for an emergency voucher program last spring. So that was 2020 or early summer, maybe, because there was some out there. There was some draft legislation or some legislation that kind of missed the boat and didn't have the perspective, I would say, of the PHA. And so we were happy to kind of craft a proposal that took the framework that Congress had came up with, but inject some of the feedback that we had gotten from members over time and input. And I want to first start by saying thank you for all the members who continue to provide feedback about operations, the voucher program, whatever it is, because we always incorporate the feedback that we get into our proposals, conversations with HUD staff and Congress, etc. So, there were a few things about the formula I think that disadvantaged lots of PHAs, including HUD weighted the formula very much towards the numbers of homelessness and homeless risk in a community, but they omitted any consideration of health data, economic data, such as unemployment, housing instability, because as we remember, this legislation is meant to respond to the pandemic and the economic and housing instability that has really caused. And so it's unfortunate that those weren't included. But more importantly, I think HUD would have done well to have a maximum award amount. By not having a maximum award amount, their formula distributed 60% of the vouchers to the top 10% of PHAs. And so that means that, the largest awards are above 5,000, and the smallest ones go down to 15. So NYCHA got an award of 5,700 vouchers. The median award is, I believe, 36 vouchers. And so that shows how the allocation was skewed, unfortunately. And I think HUD really missed the boat on that in terms of making sure this resource got really widely dispersed. But we were able to secure, I think, what's almost one of the things that are most important, which is robust funding for the program. We submitted a recommendation to HUD that included full per voucher administrative funding, funds to allow for supportive services and like security deposits or landlord outreach and recruiting, and also set up fees for housing authorities to stand up the program. All three of those were included with, in addition to one stream of fund that rewards PHAs for quickly leasing these vouchers. And so we believe these robust funds are really what's necessary to support the voucher program more generally. And we believe that this funding structure can be used as a model for the administration's proposal to expand the voucher program, which Arlene talked about. So it's not, full funding of admin fees is really the floor. But if you really want the voucher program to be successful, especially if you're talking about adding 100,000 vouchers across the country, we need to really invest in the program, the operations, and allow PHAs to do the work that's necessary in their communities to ensure voucher holders are as or more attractive than all other renters in their community. There's an article in the most recent Advocate that was just published on our website, I believe this week, that has more details and analysis that I encourage you to view, or shoot any questions in the Q&A box for later. But now I want to pass it off to, I believe, David. Yep.
Yes, hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Seth. I'm going to talk a little bit about the CARES Act waivers and some recent HUD meetings regarding those waivers. Really even before COVID, HUD has argued for deregulation, reduction of regulation. And soon as the pandemic hit and was acknowledged, PHADA called for broad regulatory waivers. And HUD actually followed through and granted a lot of those waivers, as you all know. They have the latest notice PIH 2021-14 from earlier this month, extends almost all of the waivers to the end of calendar year 2021. So that is something we certainly appreciate. They also, changed, they are not going to issue any FAS or CMAP scores in 2021. They were going to issue advisory scores for FAS, and we were going to resume CMAP, which we had said, no, you really shouldn't do this yet. And they have moved it back. We do still have a concern of trying to do scores in 2022 based on 2021 pandemic data, but we will continue to discuss all that with HUD as the year progresses. They also did not waive the public housing annual inspection requirement. So all public housing units will need to be inspected during calendar year 2021. The other change in the most recent note, the significant change, is that they are now allowing self-certification of income on initials so that applicants can self-certify and you can proceed to admit them without the additional verification if you can't get it. And similarly on new admissions, the documentation of eligibility in terms of the Social Security number or eligible non-citizen status, you can admit them to your program as long as you secure that confirmation within 90 days. Perhaps what's most interesting is that HUD and there's been some discussion about which of these waivers have proven most beneficial and should be made permanent. We should just get rid of that regulation or that and perhaps adopt the alternative requirement. And they've held some discussions and had two, one dividing some of these topics into things that are regulatory that they could change through a rulemaking process, as well as items that are statutory that would require Congress to take some action. They do seem to be seriously looking at this and considering approaches to that. It is going to be a process. It's going to take some time. And your participation in some of that may be very beneficial, especially where we may need Congress to take some action to change the requirement. So I think that if you have other questions on that, we do have some information on the website. And of course, you can put things into the Q&A box. Now, if we move on, I was just going to touch on evictions. I'm sure most of you have followed this in the news. As of the latest, there is an injunction allowing the continued enforcement of the CDC's eviction moratorium. That is the ruling which throughout the moratorium was stayed by another court pending the appeal. So the CDC eviction moratorium continues, but of course that does require tenants to certify their situation. And in terms of enforcement, that's going to come down ultimately to local jurisdictions. They may have other eviction moratoriums, and of course, different lower courts may interpret things their own way at times, as we know. And ultimately, landlord-tenant law is governed by state authority. So everyone can work that out locally. Based on what their courts are doing. It does not appear at this time that HUD is going to issue any separate eviction moratoriums just for HUD assisted housing. I think now that the CDC has stepped up, HUD is stepping back from that, and we'll let that process play out. I do think that HUD will be looking for folks to really make every effort to keep people housed and to house more people, so that you'll have to work out those specific situations. So that's really the evictions update. And with that, I will turn it over, I believe, to Jim Armstrong.
Thank you, David. I want to talk about what's up or what's not up with the fair housing rules that have been in process for quite some time. But before I do, I just want to add to David's presentation. If you're interested in checking out state and local eviction moratoria, the Eviction Lab website maintains an inventory of those. So Google Eviction Lab, and you can find on their site an inventory of states and localities that have moratoria, and also the times that those are scheduled to continue to. On the fair housing rule, as you probably know, we've been going through almost a decades-long process of revising fair housing standards and of revising HUD's affirmatively furthering fair housing rule and process. During the Obama administration, we ended up with a final rule that imposed a requirement for preparing an assessment of fair housing on localities and housing authorities. And after the 2016 election, the Trump administration published its intention to revise those and suspend the implementation of those rules. They did revise the rules and published a revision to the disparate impact standard and to the affirmatively furthering fair housing regulation late in that presidential term. As part of his campaign literature, President Biden indicated that he was promising to re-implement the Obama administration rules. So far, at least, things have been relatively quiet. Although I believe Secretary Fudge and others have indicated that they're moving ahead with revisions. There has been a little bit of noise on the OMB website concerning reviews required by executive orders of potential regulatory actions. And at the moment, both the disparate impact standard rule and the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule are listed as pending proposed rulemaking. If the department goes through that process, they will publish a proposal in the Federal Register, open for public comment concerning how they intend to re-implement both of those regulations. We'll go through a process of reviewing comments, and then we'll publish a final rule. So we are still probably a fair distance away from seeing the re-implementation of fair housing regulations. And we really don't know yet what exactly the Obama administration is planning to do. They could simply re-implement the processes that the Obama administration undertook, or they could try to tweak and change that process to accommodate some of the comments they received over the course of rulemaking earlier. This has been going on, I believe, since 2012, when the HUD when HUD initially announced that it was in the process of developing changes to the fair housing regulations. So we're 9 years in without having a final rule implemented yet. And it's likely that we're some months at least away from seeing what exactly the Biden administration is planning to do to implement a new regime for affirmatively furthering fair housing and a new standard for disparate impacts. However, it's very likely that that implementation will look an awful lot like what the Obama administration had proposed and put into regulation before 2016. And that's about all the news that I have on fair housing issues.
Thank you, Jim. I just wanted the last topic we wanted to get into ties directly into what Jim was just speaking about. We're going to talk about HUD's personnel challenges. One of the reasons FADA had such serious concerns about the Obama version of the Fair Housing Rule was that it created a lot of burdens for PHAs, but it also created many burdens for HUD. And Jim Armstrong and I spent many a meeting with HUD staff talking about how the proposed regulation was very unrealistic, in that the department would never have the capacity to read all of the submissions that the Obama version of the Fair Housing Rule would have required. And Jim can tell you that when we talk privately with the HUD staff, they would willingly concede that point. So we're concerned that if the Biden administration does put out a rule similar to the Obama version, both PHAs won't have the administrative capacity because it's so burdensome, but then the department will not have the capacity. And what is the point of PHAs doing the equivalent of 6 weeks of work to compose a fair housing plan that nobody at HUD really has the capacity to review? That's the issue here when we talk about HUD personnel challenges. And I should say, we're delighted that this week, the Senate Banking Committee will in all likelihood vote to confirm Adrienne Todman as Deputy Secretary. And I expect shortly after that, the full Senate will confirm her. She's extremely well qualified for that position. She's run housing authorities like you all in the audience. But Adrienne will have a very difficult challenge on her hand on this personnel issue. I was scrolling through the list of participants a moment ago, and I saw my friend Joe Schiff is in the audience. Joe was the Assistant Secretary for Public Housing when Jack Kemp was Secretary in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Joe did a great job when he was at HUD, and he remains a very good friend of FADA and a great consultant, by the way. When Joe was Assistant Secretary at HUD almost 30 years ago, it's hard to believe, the department, I believe, had about twice as many staff as it does now. And that in and of itself tells you something. We've all seen what's happened to HUD over the years. I recall going to hearings 10 years ago and HUD secretaries from both political parties warning that a day was coming when HUD would not have the sufficient staff to carry out its mandate. And that time is now here. That time is here. And it's a dynamic that has implications for all of us, including those of us in the industry. Now, Secretary Fudge has said right from the get-go that the department needs more staff, more resources, because HUD has had a lot more responsibility bestowed upon it by Congress. And I was recounting that story to some members recently, and they say, where have we heard that before? It's very similar to the argument that we in the industry have made to HUD, and that is, if you're going to put all these burdens and duties on us, then you need to give us adequate resources to run the programs, or change the rules to make them more flexible so we can run the programs. And that's essentially what HUD is telling Congress right now. Again, you've seen it in the field, all of the people who have left. Just in the last few months, it was publicly announced that Greg Byrne, who's been very active in running the RAD program, will be retiring from the department. David Vargas, the former REACT director, is leaving after the summer when he's done running the emergency voucher program. These are two longtime dedicated HUD employees who have a lot of institutional memory and knowledge, and they're not easily replaceable. And the IG pointed out recently that about 63% of HUD staff can retire next year if they want, including about 50% of the managers and supervisors. So again, this has significant implications, not only for HUD, but for our industry. And what FADA is doing relative to this discussion is saying to the department, look, you've got to recognize you need to do business different ways, given this harsh reality, because it takes you 200 days to fill jobs over there. You're never going to fix this through attrition. So focus on risk. Give well-run PHAs more flexibility, less interference from field office staff to local housing authorities. Consider things like changes in FAS and CMAP to give more latitude to well-run agencies, less oversight, rely more on the independent public audit. Look at accreditation as a possibility for oversight mechanism. But the bottom line is HUD is faced with a situation, just like we are, of diminishing personnel, diminishing resources, and more of a mandate. And that's an argument we will be making to Adrian Todman and to others over at HUD, who by the way, all work very hard. But the rules, like the fair housing rule that Jim was just discussing, need to be realistic in terms of their scope and magnitude, given the personnel situation. So with that, Blake, we can take some questions, and I would invite, I think we want to have all the staff come back on camera and have their mics ready for Q&A. One question I noticed in the early on, and it had something to do like, well, what the gist of the question was, what do you think in reality is going to happen with the budget? You've told us what's in the president's budget, but what do you as experts believe will really happen relative to the 22 budget? Now, the only person who can tell you that is Joe Schiff. Right? He's got the crystal ball, and he's not on with me. So I will tell you this. We really don't know what's going to happen. This is a whole new Congress, a whole new administration. It's still early. But just before we went live, we, the policy staff, were talking about a meeting we had with a Senate appropriations staffer last week. And one of the things she said to us was, look, the Senate is split 50-50. Kamala Harris, the vice president's the tie-breaking vote. To get things done in the United States Senate, you've got to work in a bipartisan fashion. Now, I know the recent emergency bill went through and that got adopted. That was done through the budget reconciliation process. and it got through by the thinnest of margins. It's not clear that Congress is going to be able to replicate that reconciliation process. All this to say that, you know, there's a very slim margin in the House of Representatives. I think it's a 6 to 10 vote margin over there. It's a tie in the Senate, and the Senate is going to require a bipartisan process. All that to say, it's going to be difficult to get some of these big spending packages through appropriations, but we're certainly going to work in furtherance of trying to move, especially the infrastructure package forward, as well as a voucher expansion bill. And I invite any of the other staff to chime in on that.
Well, I pointed out that, you know, we haven't seen the budget, right? So we don't even know what's in the operating fund, but we heard that, you know, renewals will be fully funded, and there's no reason to believe the operating fund and vouchers won't be funded. Probably shouldn't go without saying, but we haven't seen the budget, so we don't really know even what the numbers are yet, and we'll know in a few weeks. But I do think it's significant, the kind of funding we received through COVID, even before Biden was president, and particularly, and I did try to answer this question to the gentleman who asked it, particularly on admin fees, where I think what we saw was, as soon as COVID hit and CARES funding came out, there's a massive amount of money for admin fees, suggesting that Congress does understand that in order to get things done and to address staffing needs, to help families and do all the things you all have to do, you need admin fees. And we've been telling them that for a decade. And we've seen prorations in the 70s and 80s %. And so we're hoping that they can't go back to that old story now. We don't understand what admin fees are for. Well, yeah, you do, because you just gave us 850 million of them. And, you know, we want you to keep doing that. So that'll be one of the areas to look at. And, you know, I still think that there's so many supporters of the capital fund in Congress that, you know, there might be a miracle there.
Well, most notably, Chuck Schumer, the majority leader in the Senate, is calling for a doubling of President Biden's proposal. And of course, Schumer is quite influential, being the majority leader. So folks like Brenda Westphal, Matt Carter, and others, and Bill Simmons in New York have been making a good case to Chuck Schumer.
So Tim, you might correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that if the budget proposes, say, fully funding the operating fund and a number north of 3 billion for capital, that would be, if I remember correctly, the first time in 20 years that any administration has proposed to fully fund the operating fund. And so what makes through Congress is one thing, but this is the first time in 20 years that we've had an administration friendly enough to assisted housing to ask for that kind of money.
Right, and I did want to add that on the other side of that, because the environment's changed and that's not a poison pill necessarily, and I think a lot of Republican members of Congress understand that money that goes to public housing authorities goes to their districts and their constituents. And so in the parse down, and also in the parse down of a budget, that public housing might actually do reasonably well, especially in the capital, capital side, because it's an economic driver in a lot of places. And I did also want to mention, and following up on Jim's comments about fair housing, is that in the last year or two, I think we've increasingly recognized how broadly fair housing is an issue in our whole housing system. And that as this administration tries to look at it more broadly, looks at things like zoning, how they can try to incentivize or influence local zoning decisions, that may come into play in how they structure their fair housing rules and what they try to impose, so that it may end up looking more comprehensive, and hopefully housing authorities won't be expected to do a separate one, because that doesn't make sense. It needs to be more comprehensive. So I'm hopeful that some of the folks at HUD are looking at it from that perspective.
I see we don't have any questions yet, and Blake, please let me know if we do. But let me just finish this point. One thing I want to just reiterate Jim Armstrong's point. It's really nice to be in a position where we have an administration that's supportive of our affordable housing programs. The Biden administration clearly is supportive. PHADA staff and our new president, David Northern, and our new senior vice president, Mark Gillett, and myself and Arlene Kahn will be meeting with the other industry groups later in the week to talk with them about promotion of the Biden administration's objective to significantly expand the voucher program. That's something that we strongly support, and we're going to be working on that with in collaboration with the other industry groups. But I think Jim's exactly right that this is a different position that we find ourselves in than we have in some time. Blake, did you want to ask a question?
Oh, we did have just a couple here. One was asking if any of the panelists here could talk about the emergency rental assistance program and whether federally assisted households will be eligible.
So I actually did mention that in my briefing. Very briefly in my briefing, but yes, that had been a question that we got from a lot of our members because some states and localities were saying that if you receive federally subsidized assistance, you would not be eligible. But that would only be for the portion where there's already assistance provided. So if that would be a duplicate of assistance. But the part of the formula, the tenant paid rent is not something that's covered by the housing authority, and that portion, the tenant rent itself, could be covered under this program. In practical terms, though, it seems like most states and localities will structure their programs so that those who don't have federal assistance will receive a priority, and therefore our funds may not be available to help those families in the end, but at least we know that they are eligible. And that was the $45 billion in emergency rental assistance that I mentioned.
And on that,
So go ahead, Seth.
yeah, the point I was going to make is that Arlene's absolutely correct, but this is also where you as a PHA, your relationship with your local county or city officials, or depending on where you are, your state folks, is really important, because you can go to them with your needs as a landlord or on behalf of your tenants and figure out how to connect those resources to the families that you serve. I know of PHAs that have gotten their entire balances for their public housing residents taken care of by the city through the use of these funds. Other industry groups, we had a call, I think, with HUD last week, and other industry groups were talking about the same thing, folks from NARO. So those, have conversations, figure out who you need to talk to. And also on the flip side, if you've got an EHV allocation, again, you're just reinforcing those local connections. And so it's all about, how can we work together to help serve the families that you serve, which are members of the city, residents or of the city, county, et cetera.
Yeah, I was going to add
that
the essentially eligibility and priority for families receiving assistance is in the hands of states and localities that get the funds, as Arlene said. And the Treasury official that spoke to us acknowledged that they corrected the mistake that they made originally in implying that assisted households were ineligible, but they were not going to go back and bend anybody's arm to get them to change policies that created a hierarchy of need in the state that meant that unassisted households might receive assistance ahead of assisted households. So you may find that your families and your voucher programs and your public housing programs may not be able to access this funds, although they are eligible.
Blake?
Just a reminder that please put your questions in the Q&A box. We don't have any.
All right. Well, if you don't have a question, Blake, one thing I want to mention to everyone, we just were alerted earlier today, and I think Dominique mentioned this yesterday in her discussion, broadband. It's become an extremely important topic in the industry, and the need for broadband, because we're all so reliant on it now, including residents who need it for work, for school, for other education opportunities. That's something that PHADA supports. We're going to entertain a motion in our upcoming meeting this afternoon in support of broadband access for all Americans. But Dominique mentioned that the department will be having a webinar on how you can use your CARES money for broadband assistance to residents. That's going to be May 25th, which is next week, and it'll be 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern time. This notice, I think, was sent out to all housing authorities and will be posted on PHADA's breaking news website, so you can look for the link and that information there. But that is a very important topic.
And I think I will say that's how to use not just your CARES funds, but operating funds.
Right.
And other funds for for providing that service.
So we have a question here. It says, my city is receiving an additional round of home funds equaling about 1.4 million that are simply stating can be used for, quote, affordable housing purposes. So do any of you know more about these additional dollars? And if you've already stated this, just apologies for that, but that was a question coming in.
I could try to take that. The home dollars are large through the CARES Act are largely going to be administered in the same way as the regular home dollars. So it will be up to whoever your city, if they're the recipient, to determine how they want to use those dollars. Now, there are expanded uses of the home dollars, so they can use it for additional rental assistance if they want to, or they can choose to use it as home dollars are more traditionally used in trying to develop additional housing supply that has some rent restriction. So again, that's, as Seth was saying, your relationships with those grantee entities are the key to talk about what your need is, how that might match up with what the city is looking to do. So best I could do on that one, I thought.
We have another question. Looks like it's just come in. So it's saying, this is a familiar debate. Should tenants who already are getting a deep subsidy also get emergency assistance, public or private funds, if they get behind on rent or utilities? So here in St. It's a two-part, or continues. Here in St. Paul, that has largely been resolved in favor of allowing the subsidized tenants to get the extra help rather than losing the voucher or public housing lease. They are some of the lowest income families with the greatest needs, and PHAs can advocate for that outcome.
Yeah, so the way I look at it, and can agree or disagree, I guess, a family that is applying for those emergency rental assistance funds, let's say that lost a job, and they were earning $80,000 a year, and they have a rent of $2,000, they can get that entire rent covered under the emergency rental assistance funding. So why shouldn't a subsidized tenant be able to have the entire rent covered, including his or her share? That's just making it equal to private market tenants, many of whom have much higher incomes and maybe have savings that they could use that assisted households do not. And assisted households have also been spending their funds on things that weren't expected, like additional food because children have been at home, or medical bills that might not be covered through insurance, or helping other family members. So it's those kinds of things that come up, and why they could need the additional funding.
And we've heard from members who have reported that, for example, some households had extreme issues crop up in their family, their relatives, and felt compelled to help out. There are all kinds of reasons why assisted households may have ended up in a financial bind that would not be accommodated by the rent rules in assisted housing. So there are folks who have experienced difficulties, and so it's likely that the population in assisted housing, seems to me, that would be working to get some of this emergency rental assistance would be relatively small compared with other populations of renters, but they exist, and so I think they ought to be able to get in the queue to get assistance if they're eligible for it. Yeah.
Okay, well, we don't have any more questions, but we are at the end of our session. So if anyone has any final parting words.
Well,
before
Blake,
we
actually,
wrap up.
yes, actually, I did want to say this. This is the last session of the conference. I do want to again thank everybody for participating. I have seen most of the sessions live or on video. They are available, and this session will be available on video later today. I think that they've really been great quality sessions, very informative, very timely. I really appreciate the work of the PHADA staff and the Professional Development Committee, and Sarah Patterson especially working on this meeting. But I want to remind members that we want to see you in person. It's nice that we can do these Zoom meetings and talk to you this way, but we really are looking forward to seeing you in person. And in all likelihood, PHADA will gather in person in September, pending some further discussions with the DC hotel and looking at the rules, but it's looking very likely and very, very encouraging that we're going to meet in September. So I hope you'll consider coming to that meeting in September. It will be very timely. We'll get to interact on a personal basis. The other thing I want to mention is I mentioned that David Northern is now our new president, and with a new presidency, that means we're reconstituting all of our committees for the next 2 years. So we have a lot of great committee members, but like HUD, we've seen a lot of turnover in our industry. Many people have departed and retired. I was looking at Nancy Walker's session just yesterday. She was a former president, one of the smartest people in the industry, but Nancy's retired and we lost her off of our board. So we want to encourage more of you to get involved in PHADA and to get active on a committee where you can help, as John Hodge said yesterday, you can really help shape the future of this industry by being involved in PHADA. There's no question about that. So please reach out to any of us or Norma Ballou, our membership director. And I hope to see many of you in person in September. And with that, Blake, I'll turn it over to you.
Tim. And so this does conclude PHADA's virtual 2021 annual convention and exhibition. Thank you all for attending. Just a reminder that the recording for this session, as well as all of the others, will be available on the Whova mobile and web app. And we invite all of you to take the session survey, as well as the conference surveys, both available in Whova as well. So again, thanks everyone for attending. We do look forward to seeing you all soon, and in person especially. So thank you and goodbye.